I'm sure that all of you have seen at one time or another the man on the street interviews, where someone walks up to a stranger to ask them a question about something just to simply see if they can give either the right answer or even an answer at all. Many times it's a question about history or politics or some other social concern, but hardly ever a question about one's faith or one's religion. It's almost as if that topic would be taboo if you were doing a man on the street interview. But just suppose this morning that I were walking around in here and handing out this microphone to say, well, when is the last time God did something for you? And what would happen if that were really the case? How would you respond? Maybe you'd like the question rephrased a little differently. When was the last time you were aware that God was working in your life? Maybe that would be more helpful to you as you began to think about how God is not only at work in your life, but in the very world itself. You know, we move so quickly through the hours of our days that many times when God is at work, we simply are not aware. It passes us by because we're so intent on looking at what's right in front of us. And yet there isn't any circumstance in our lives where God does not have a way of saying a word to us. All that we are and all that we do is enhanced and made better when we are listening for the voice of God to give us some sense of direction. And friends, when we hear that voice, whether it be the small, still voice that kind of creeps up on us, or whether it comes to us in a momentous decision about a great decision that we're having to make, it should fill us with wonder. Wonder because God has made a commitment to us. Wonder because God has been faithful in every generation to the promises that God has made. I think about that Old Testament reading where Joshua and the people of Israel are about to cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land. How many of these folk over that 40 years of wandering in the wilderness were aware that it wasn't just that God was with them, but God was going before them to prepare the way? And isn't that simply the message that comes out of that wandering time for God's people? To know that in those 40 years in the wilderness, not once did God abandon them. Not once did God leave them to the circumstances of their own momentary existence or the fate of the decisions they made, which probably brought some pain or anxiety to everyone. God did not abandon them. And here we are on the bank of the River Jordan. The Ark of the Covenant is to go before God's people into the Promised Land. Why would that be? It's a reminder that in every circumstance these folks faced during that time of wilderness, it was God who was in front of them preparing the way. So why wouldn't it make sense that the ark representing God's presence should be the first to pass over the Jordan into the Promised Land? A sure sign that it was God who brought them out of slavery into a new life. It was a time for remembering, and it was a time for them to be filled with wonder, to remember that it was God's act that was so important at every step of their journey. That's why I say this morning, when was the last time you were full of wonder? That God had somehow gone before you to prepare the way. It's not easy, you see, in the lifestyle we live today, and maybe it wasn't easy for those wandering in the wilderness, to know that God is indeed going before us to prepare the way. We get so enmeshed in the momentary existence of our day-to-day lives that sometimes we don't anticipate what God is about to do or what God can do if we simply open ourselves to an awareness of God's presence. I think about that, especially when I think about the Apostle Paul and these letters he wrote to these various churches. But in this case, he's talking about his own presence in the town of Thessalonica. He came there as an ambassador of Jesus Christ. And he worked day and night earning his own keep so that he wouldn't be a burden on the life of this young Christian community. But he did that because he knew that the very source of his life and strength was God himself. In Jesus Christ, he had seen what God was able to do. Now, if I had that microphone and I had an opportunity to interview Paul about when was he full of wonder at what God was doing, it certainly would have been, at least on one occasion, that road to Damascus experience, where he was a keeper of the law and on his way to persecute the believers in Jesus Christ. And in a moment of time, a light came to him, the light dawned, and it was a transforming, life-changing moment. Friends, God has a way of making that possible for all of us. Now, we're not going to have perhaps such a dramatic event as Paul did on the road to Damascus, but certainly we would be filled with wonder if we could stop long enough to see God's pattern unfolding for our individual lives. I have often said to my colleagues, I could never have imagined how God would take a 17-year-old kid from a small town in the Midwest and unfold a life that I have experienced. I am full of wonder at what God can do and does do. And my prayer is that all of us would somehow find that same sense of wonder, that God has come to us, is with us, and is at work for our good, moving us into a life that we can't imagine and we couldn't actually have done on our own. It's an amazing thing what God can do. That's what Paul was trying to say to these young Christians in this city in Asia Minor. Here you are in a place that isn't always very friendly to the teachings of Jesus, but here we are to encourage you, to help you see that you're not alone here, and that God has gone before you to plant this community of faith and to give it its purpose, its courage, its hope, its strength. And we know from history that these small groups of Christians actually sowed the seeds of our own spiritual faith journeys because they remained hopeful in Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus, when we read in the Gospel of Matthew this morning, he is trying to convince folk that it isn't simply a matter of the law. He's not against the law. He wants the law to be something that enhances our lives, but not to be a burden upon our shoulders. And time again, he talks to the crowds, and the scribes and the Pharisees are there, but not because they want to hear what Jesus says, but to plan their next strategy to short-circuit what Jesus is trying to accomplish. Think what a different world it would have been if those scribes and Pharisees had been open to what God was trying to do. If they had let go long enough to let God. And so many times in our own lives, that is the way we need to respond. Let go long enough to let God. I would have been in a far different place today, and perhaps you would have been too. And so if I were the man on the street and I were talking to you about your spiritual journeys and your belief and your faith, what would you say? When has God made God's self known to you? When have you felt the presence of the living God in such a way that you knew you could move into the next day with the assurance that you were in God's care and keeping, no matter what was in front of you? These people wandering in the wilderness, these Thessalonians in this little city somewhere in Asia Minor, and even Jesus himself, It was absolutely audacious for him to speak to the scribes and the Pharisees the way he did. Where did he get his courage? Where did he get his sense of what God was really all about? He got it from God. He knew that God was at work in him and through him in some way that he could not be silent. He could not simply exile himself into oblivion. He had to speak, and he had to live what God was asking him to do and be. Think, if you will, all through the Gospels. Time after time, Jesus does the unexpected. Why is that? Because God is leading him into the next step of his journey to reveal to us what it is God is trying to say to us and do for us. When Jesus encounters somebody filled with demons and he drives the demons out, the Pharisees and scribes would have walked on by because they didn't want to be defiled by the sin of that man. Or when Jesus is in the country of Samaria and talking to a woman by the well in the heat of a day, even his disciples are critical of his actually walking through this Samaritan land. But God has a purpose that is to be fulfilled. And so it is with our lives as well. When we read the scriptures and see how God is at work in the Old and the New Testament, it should be a reminder to us that God continues to be at work. God continues to touch our lives through whatever circumstance we may be. Sometimes it's through a painful moment. Sometimes it's through a moment of defeat. And sometimes it's through a moment of great joy, anticipation, and celebration. Whatever it is, if you just listen, God's at work in that moment for your good and for the good of those around you. We need to be more filled with wonder than we are. It's a wonder we're here today. The wonder is that there were some folk who were faithful to the good news of Jesus Christ. And somehow it made a difference in our lives. It's a wonder that God hasn't given up on this world. That God sent Jesus Christ into this world because he believes it can be redeemed and he believes it can reach its purpose. It's a wonder, you see. It's a wonder that God cares about you. It's a wonder that God cares about me enough to have sent Jesus Christ. That's what the people of the Old Testament must have felt at the bank of the River Jordan. It's a wonder that we're here at all. That's what the church in Thessalonica must have felt. It's a wonder that God is our hope and our strength. And when Jesus was preaching, even in the presence of the scribes and the Pharisees, there were folk who were listening. And they said, it's a wonder that he has the courage to proclaim this word, which truly brings us to life and to the fullness of life that God wants for each of us. It's a wonder. It's a wonder that God's going to keep speaking to each of us in such a way that our lives can begin to blossom and fulfill God's purpose. To keep doing it, because that's what the world needs. The world needs to wonder. The man on the street, what would you say? When was the last time you were aware that God was at work in the circumstances of your life?